not to, try to love through, shape change in the nether-pool, and drown with friends, to arise anew again and again. Welcome to A Mutant Manifesto, Episode 7. I am joined by co-hosts Carson and Josh, and also Zach, who I've known for a while, from my LA days and from Minnesota back in the day. He now resides in New York City, and makes he's like a genius violinist and musician, composer. He does experimental violin work under the guise of Zachary Paul, and then also is in Chanel Beads, touring the world, and does all sorts of different collaborations in New York City as well currently, and has all sorts of entanglements and all sorts of different cool music stuff, ambient worlds, pop worlds. We had some cringy outsider pop stuff that we were getting into in LA together back in 2017. But
it's really good.
yeah, there's a certain collaboration that our alter egos made back then that, yeah. But
we could use it as a music.
Yeah, if you're lucky enough, you might hear a little segment of it right now. He also is involved in several different sort of activist groups as well, currently in New York. Yeah. Zach, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited.
So before we get into the topic of the day, I wanted to ask you all how you're feeling, how you've been feeling this week.
I mean, I can start. This week, generally fatigued and
Oh, have you been tired? Oh, has it been a bad week? You think I actually care? No, of course I don't care. I don't care at all about you fucks. It's the Wetiko episode. Wetiko, Wetiko, Wetiko. I don't give a fuck about you. Do. Yeah, I don't give a care. I don't give anything about any of you. None of you matter. You're all pawns in my greater scheme to take over the world. This podcast is going the way of Joe Rogan, baby.
Nice.
This week we will be discussing the topic of Wetiko. the viral psychic pathogen that was articulated by Jack For. I mean, it's a long story about how this even comes about to begin with. But I did want to I guess me, Josh, and Zach have read Paul Levy's Dispelling Wetiko for this episode. But this concept goes all over the place, and it's origins are kind of have always been here, and also the ways that it's currently understood. There's a million different ways to understand it. But it's basically the question is, what makes us, selfish and cut off from one another? And how do we understand that? I think maybe as a good way to introduce the topic, I was actually kind of curious because both Josh and Zach mentioned like the word Wetiko when I was bringing up the ideas I had in relation to a mutant manifesto with them, like before the beginning of the podcast. And so I thought it would make a lot of sense to bring them together to talk about this episode. I was wondering if you guys could maybe like go over how you came across the concept, and then like why you thought it would be interesting to talk about in the context of a mutant manifesto.
Yeah, I can start if that's all right. Um, so I found out, or I first read about it like 2 years ago. When I read the Jack Forbes book, which is called Columbus and Other Cannibals. And I actually found out about that book via the Collapse of Society subreddit for some reason, which I was like on every day as I was feeling very doomer, and I still do in some ways. But yeah, I read Columbus and Other Cannibals. I'd also love to I kind of went through that book again today. Because I think he does a really good job of like the Paul Levy book is much more internal and not very political. Near the end he sort of tries, but it's like very like kind of white liberal political, and the Forbes is actually like super radical, and I just kind of wanted to go through it and like um remember some of the key points. But he has a really good definition of it kind of early on that I think might be good to like set the stage. Um However, when I read this book 2 years ago, I thought it was interesting. I didn't really think much about it until 2 years later when um I did this like uh, I'll just get into it, I guess. I did like this like psychedelic sound bath thing, and like it was a little bit cringy, but it was really very transformative. And before it started, the guy who led it like gave this whole 6-hour lecture on a whole bunch of stuff. And kind of right at the end, he just sort of brought up the idea of this parasite thing. And it really like affected my whole trip, and like through that whole 6-8 hour journey or whatever, I just kept coming back to this idea of the parasite and seeing how that was like manifesting in my own life. And I think it's really very similar to a lot of the stuff you guys have been talking about. I will confess, I've only listened through episode 3B, so I'm a bit behind. But I think especially when it comes to addiction, when it comes to like thinking about what can we actually do to change the material conditions of our world, and why are we doing such a bad job at it, possibly, um the like dark underbelly that we all have but don't want to talk about or admit. I don't know, there's so much, but maybe I'll can I read this little definition and then pass it off, maybe? Is that cool?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think okay. So yeah, we're definitely going to go into the what is Wetiko more. But this would be a good primer to introduce just the audience, maybe just to give them a taste of like what this thing is, this nebulous thing that we're talking about. So sure, yeah. But I do want to ground it in you guys' like personal, like how you got to it as well. So yeah, perfect.
Okay, word. Um, yeah, because I also want to propose that maybe we call it by another name in this episode. Um, for for the sake of like not appropriating. Um, but this definition kind of gives like the background of the word. I don't know. Here we go. Uh, Wetiko is a Cree term, otherwise known as Windigo in Ojibwe or Wintiko in Powhatan, which refers to a cannibal, or more specifically to an evil person or spirit who terrorizes other creatures by means of terrible evil acts, including cannibalism. Wetiko Watizwan, an abstract noun, refers to diabolical wickedness or cannibalism. That's it. And I really think of it as like this parasite. when I was like having my trip thing, I was just like kept um imagining or just like seeing all the ways in which society has fed me so much when I was a child that like led to bad habits down the road, and the ways in which like the evil forces have just been like sucking away at my energy, which feels very woo woo to say, but we'll get into it more. I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. I had a very different experience encountering this. I I was leaving some sort of event roughly in like 20 like late 2018, 2019. I had just returned to DC and I'd gotten an Uber pool or a Lyft, some sort of like Lyft pool. And one of the people, this is at like 1 a.m., one of the people in the car with me was this woman that I'll call T. And we were just sort of prattling off about, philosophy and like ways of being and like blackness, etc., and exchanged numbers. Then few months later, down the line, or actually no, a few years later, maybe a year or two later, like like just before the pandemic hit, she sent me that article. Let me just figure out who the authors are really quick. I'm not very good with the names, but the Alnor Ladha and the Martin Kirk article sent me that article to talk about some of the apocalyptic things that we had started talking about. And this is mostly like me shitting on Boston. And in reading it, I felt like I finally understood the like a general apathy that I felt was everywhere and maybe more prevalent in places like Boston and DC or just large metropolitan areas. I I started like questioning my own relationship to whatever form of altruism I inherited from like my Christian background, right, and my father's faith, and how that sort of relates to just existing in society and what that means and why I feel like that wasn't making any progress anywhere or why that wasn't spreading good like I was told would spread good. And then sort of tangentially, in like I guess like different types of fantasy media, the concept of like the Wendigo was something that I was aware of, and it was sort of around, and I was trying to mash these two concepts together. And I always had the idea of the sort of like a werewolf or this sort of like a fiend, like an actual physical manifestation, but to have it be reversed and understood as a mind virus really changed my whole thinking, and thinking that it was something that infected all of us as a whole, as a part of the colonial enterprise was really mind opening, I guess. And yeah, and I guess to answer the question of how or why I thought of it immediately for this podcast was just that I don't know if it was the first episode or maybe the episode 0 intro, but I remember just thinking about things and like infection and something that sort of alters your way of being. And this sort of jumped out to the forefront of my mind, like, oh, there's this really cool article. You got to read it. And this concept of Wetiko, or I guess, I'm trying. What does Levy call it? It's like the eco. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, this leads perfectly into the next like segment here, because like, what is Wetiko? What is Wetiko? Because there's a couple. It's like one of these words that's caught on a little bit, and does seem like it has sort of encapsulated multiple strands of types of people into understanding this sort of viral figuring that happens but there's like a million different words for it. There's a million different concepts that would fit into this idea. But yeah, Paul Levy in this book, Paul Levy is like kind of like a hippy dippy like new wave thinker, but he's I think tries. He seems very invested in like the traditions of like alchemy from a Western perspective, and different spiritual practices like Jungian psychology, like the archetypes and the subconscious are really important to him. Shamanism is a big thing for him, which is something that I find a little bit. I see shamanism as like a Western creation that's put upon the like noble indigenous communities. It's sort of like, but it's not really necessarily like indigenous communities don't call themselves shamans. Shaman is like a word that's been sort of invented and sort of put onto indigenous communities in different places. But anyway, shamanism though is an interesting concept that is functional from a magical perspective. That's how I see it, and is descriptive of a certain thing. But anyway, so that's what Paul Levy is, and his book Dispelling Wetiko, he actually has like he puts a lot of attention to saying that it's called Wetiko in this language, Wendigo in this. There's different words in different indigenous lexicons, but then there are other words for it as well. Vampire, demon. He says the me disease, it's like an acronym. It's a play on words that stands for maladapted egophrenia.
I think it's malignant.
Malignant egophrenia. Right. He was saying, like, in the book, he was like, yeah, me and my friends were sitting around trying to discuss, like, how do we come up with a word for this thing? And they were pitching different ideas. And they thought, like, me disease, oh, that works for different things. They were playing around with how the me in that could mean different things. It could stand for different words and different, like, lexiconal things. But basically, he also says that, like, we need to be able to understand, like, evil exists. But if we don't have, he's kind of pays attention to this fact that without words for things, we actually have, words are such a big part of control that we as symbolically entrenched beings, humans, quote unquote, we rely on words quite a lot to shape the world around us. So we need like words to contain things in order to manipulate them. So we need to have some kind of way to encapsulate this evil figure in a word. So like, what word can we use for that? There's multiple ones we could use. But the Wetiko is a good one because it kind of gathers a lot of different elements together into one symbol that has like a cultural significance that works a certain way. Kind of gestures to this colonial moment while also saying that this exists before and outside of colonialism. So it's interesting to this idea of like, I mean, I think it not like goes without saying that this question of whether to use the word Wetiko is interesting. None of us being indigenous to North America, but I find the word, there's a lot of different. I personally think that like words are borrowed all the time from one culture to another, and they also, but like there's a million different ways to describe this thing. So like it would be okay to use it. Like there's no reason not to choose a different word to describe it. Do we want to pause really quickly on that topic, like whether to use Wetiko specifically before we try to describe more like what this thing even is?
Yeah, I think it makes sense, right? Like, Because I feel like this is an opportunity for us to decide which direction we're going to go in trying to encapsulate this thing, like to find a container for the virus. And so maybe the title that we use for it points us in the direction of like how we discuss about it. And of course we can use different titles because it has many different heads, but
yeah, and that's
I don't know.
exactly,
That was my thinking.
That's exactly the question that comes up. Like, why did Paul Levy use Wetiko? Why did Jack Forbes? Why did that catch on in a certain way? You know. So, like, first, what does it mean that they chose that specific lineage to and that specific word? And then B, what does it mean that people were attracted to it a certain way? And is it like worthwhile to stay with?
Yeah. Sorry for like throwing that out there randomly too before the episode is going.
I mean, it's definitely like an interesting topic that I think is worth staying with for a second here.
I'm pretty sure Jack Forbes was
Jack. Yeah, he's an indigenous, right?
Um,
And he brought up, and just to clarify, like in his book, Columbus and Other Cannibals, he specifically uses the word Wetiko.
Yeah.
And is like saying like this actually applies to like modern contexts in different ways, and specifically like the colonial moment, like what just to set the scene of like what his work contributed. So like he was basically the argument. I haven't read the book, but basically the argument is that like Western imperialism basically is like a huge rampant form of Wetikoism, that it's like a cut and dry like vampiric force that just came over and like instilled the Wetiko way upon like the native population of North America, and like that's the world that we live in now. It's like a very much like Wetiko entrenched world.
Yeah, and just to that question of like why Levy uses it, he says on like page 11 of the book that like to introduce this indigenous word into the popular vernacular, as well as to honor the indigenous traditions that have created this word, in addition to wanting to access the power inherent in the mantric energy, and finally because it sounds right. So I think it, and especially because I think this book, at least Dispelling Wetiko, like Breaking the Curse of Evil, is sort of in conversation with Columbus and Other Cannibals, is why he specifically uses Wetiko, I think, like to try and honor a scholar that he particularly is fond of.
Yeah, I guess I'm like interested if there's like just a broader thing, because like there's like this idea of the Wetiko, which is the indigenous perspective on this evil demonic force or whatever. But that evil demonic force is potentially like a bigger, we're going to come at that with our own perspective that will include those perspectives as well, because we've read that stuff. But like, I don't know, it's kind of lame, I guess. But like for me, I feel a little more comfortable. Like I have the experience to talk about like the parasite, but like, because I can think about how like some parasitic force has interacted with my life, or there might be another like even more broad like thing, or the demon or whatever. But yeah, it does lose a little bit of its like spark, I guess, of the word. But I just wouldn't want anyone to think we are doing the work of like defining what Wetiko meant to the Cree people or something, which I don't think anyone would. But
That is a good point, and I think that honestly, I do like my little like thread of like susness about Paul Levy, kind of exactly is that the fact that it sounds right according to him, like the fact that it has this mystique that presents it in a way that like, oh yes, this is what I've been looking for. This is what explains this better than any white word ever could. It is, and there's the same with the idea of the shaman. Like it's a good sounding word, and it's like it's a concept that the white dudes love to trip out about. It's like, we've always had spiritual questers who walked between worlds, and it's like, oh, because you do acid and you want to like have something that justifies that in an essentialist way, where it's like, this is a grand role. Like, they designed the category of the shaman to basically say that what you're doing right now is like, it's all good, is like cool, and also is like pre-Western. There's this sort of like, you know, thing that I think we can evolve beyond a little bit. Like, but like, I think it's a reaction against the idea that like indigenous people are backwards. But like, you can't then as a response say that like their words are like sacred and untouchable. So that's kind of why I feel agnostic about using the term, but it also is why I agree that like we shouldn't attempt to go back and find what the word was and is used for in different contexts that we're outside of. Like, at this point, Wetiko is a meme, which is another thing that he talks about and a lot of people talk about here, replicating a little grain of meaning that, you know, meme is a word that existed before the just purely joke form of meme. Like, a meme is a replicating discursive tool that basically, it's like a fragment of meaning that like circulates in social circles and takes on different functions and different usages as it circulates and catches on different, you know, fragments of memes that come together to form kind of larger meaning structures. And so at this point, Wetiko has been circulated into this like online spaces and like, you know, which it means like anyone with an internet access. And now you, listener, all of us have now access to the concept of, or the word Wetiko. And so I'm kind of agnostic about it. I think that it's worth these are like the questions that like you can't help but contemplate as you're reading these things, I think, as like white people or like non-indigenous people, specifically non-indigenous like Americans, I feel like. But yeah, so I think that like a psychic parasite, or like you could say vampire, you could say demon, but all these have different contexts and different sort of like things that they catch on, which is what I feel like is interesting. But it's like the inner self-saboteur, a devil perhaps. Yeah. I'm curious if like this is a good time I'm kind of curious, like, Carson, as kind of a blank slate here, have you heard the term Wetiko before these kind of conversations? Do you have any idea of what it was before this podcast? And then also, what do you think it is at this point?
Yeah. Well, when you all brought it up about reading the book, I was like, why does this sound familiar? And yeah, when I looked it up, like the actual book, I was like, Paul Levy, I don't know who this is. I was like, this seems kind of like new agey. And then, but I was like, I'm still trying to remember why this sounds familiar. And I had heard the term Wendigo before, just probably through reading, or yeah, like, and I remembered that was like, yeah, I remembered that was like a haunting, or like some sort of like someone was overcome by like a spirit, and I couldn't remember exactly what like that spirit like made someone do, but I was like, I'm pretty sure it's like some evil thing. Yeah, I mean, this is all the only thing I was going to touch on with like the previous conversation. Yeah, maybe from like a perspective of not knowing or not having read this, is like I appreciate the diversity of like ways of thinking about it, and I like that Zach brought up like the virus, because it's like, you know, that's like a really potent like medical and like personal and I don't know, like I think that can be a useful metaphor or framework of like a infectious disease like type thing. Sometimes, like people are going to respond to something like that because they had experience with that, but then we'll be like, oh, like, you know spirits and haunting and like I don't know, like stuff like that, like they're not into. So, but then other people would be. So I feel like you could come at it from like a spiritual, like historical, anthropological um, level. And yeah, I feel like something on this podcast that we're always struggling with, but also like it's a productive struggle, is like the specificity and generality and like yeah, like this, I don't know how to keep something with its like specific potency as a term, like Wetiko, but then how to also not like but to like make it, yeah, I don't even know if I want to say like make it accessible, but like if that's what Paul Levy was trying to do, was like bring it into like some sort of popular knowledge of thinking about this, then like it's interesting to think about whether that's a useful tactic.
Well, I was thinking that it would be kind of interesting to, and this kind of is perfectly dovetails, I think. But I think it would be interesting to kind of go around for the next few minutes and sort of articulate all the different forms that this concept can take. Basically, like, what are different ways that Paul Levy, for example, explains this concept? And then, like, what are other ways that we can then also try to explain this concept? I think that some key components to what he's talking about are, it's kind of ubiquity. It's like universality. So Paul Levy is interested in the idea of archetypes, which is like Jungian archetypes. These things that exist so deeply in the human consciousness. And cards on the table, I find some of Paul Levy's thinking around the human limiting in his ability to conceive of this type of evil parasitic presence. And you see him grapple with a lot of these paradoxes and conundrums in his writing, but yeah, at some point, like, my own bias at times will be trying to deconstruct the human to try to help us figure out what this thing is and how we can work with it, maybe a little bit more fluidly. But that's just my own thing that I'm putting the cards on the table for. Now, Paul Levy brings up archetypes, memes, viruses, and other kinds of monsters like vampires and werewolves to describe what he's getting at. So archetypes are supposed to be universal, like, characters that exist in all of humans somewhere, in our collective unconscious. And we embody these different archetypes at different times in our lives. It's like a Jungian principle that's used to describe, it's kind of a departure from Freud's self-centered pathology and like family-centered pathology that instead sort of incorporates a sort of universalist idea that there's different roles that people play for one another in this sort of dream-like reality that we live in. Just like how in my dream, if I dream of like a coworker who's like injecting me with something, it's not literally my coworker who's doing it, but she takes the embodiments of some like nurse archetype or something. And so, it's not, but then maybe I'm embodying some kind of archetype to the listeners right now. They and like they're dreaming up of me, to use Paul Levy's phrasing, is significant in a certain archetypal way to them. And so, the devil on your shoulder, your inner saboteur, the drunk, the the power-hungry maniac. These are archetypes that we can identify that maybe do have like a true life, like an existential life that is expressed by this thing. And so then like understanding these archetypes helps us navigate within them a little bit. That's one way to understand it. What are some other, ways we can think about this? I think vampires and werewolves are kind of interesting, but the problem with that is that you can see a vampire and see a werewolf, and it's out as like separate entities from yourself. I think a big component of this is supposed to be that everyone has access to it. Like everyone has it inside of them.
I mean, just riffing off of that a little bit. I mean, he does kind of dip his toe into the Jungian shadow, and that being an inherent part of every person. And sometimes, or at least my previous concept of that, and like the attempt to become a full person pursuing one's creative and self-sustaining interests, is viewing the shadow as maybe something that is a driving survival force, where hunger is, or maybe the pursuit of food is the impetus, or like a precursor for greed, right, or indulgence. And I think that the mind virus version of that, where that shadow gets maybe a little bit too much energy or too much credence in one's life, or gets associated with a scarcity mindset going off the rails. And like, this to me resembles cancer, right? Like, cell reproduction is something that we naturally do, but cancer is taking that over and making that, like, putting that on steroids, quote unquote, right? And so that's one way that I've sort of thought of that connection between the shadow, one's maybe darker, or I want to say even driving forces going off the rails, and how it maybe organically manifests in one's body, actions, other things such as that.
Yeah, and then at society at large as well. Yeah, cancer being something that is part of a healthy reproductive cycle, but then takes on a self-replicating, oriented type of reproduction that ultimately sabotages not only the self, but the larger unit in which one is nested. The hungry ghost is another archetype or monster that fits this, wants to keep eating to fill itself, but is never full because it's a phantom.
I don't know if we brought this up before, but like the difference between like a grasshopper and a locust, right? Like, depending on the environment, changing the actual biology of the insect to be more feral, all-consuming, destructive force. That's another vision that I had for this mind virus.
I think you actually mentioned that in episode 3. And I was wondering if you would maybe want to go a little bit more into that, so they actually changed their biology, or and what do you find interesting about this locust grasshopper dichotomy? You want to go in on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I could. I think if we stick with the grasshopper, I think there is, in this specific animal, given a sort of abundance. Oh God, maybe I gotta look this up. I think it's during rainy seasons, or when the weather is creating an abundance of food. grasshoppers sort of change into locusts and their body structures change, and they just mow over areas, eating everything, and like crops, animals, etc. Like they just like voraciously hungry and destroy everything in their path. Now, there was a moment in the recent past, I think in like 2021, maybe 2022, where there was a news article talking about locusts in, I'm sorry, I don't remember the country, but there was a region in, I think, Eastern Africa where like locusts had formed and they were just kind of sweeping and like destroying camels, destroying crops and everything. And they're like, oh my gosh. And the memes, like the actual internet memes associated with it were like, oh, this is one of the plagues. These are the end times, etc., to reference sort of the Bible and our current state of affairs. And I think if you give me a second when you all start talking again, I'll actually look up the science behind when a grasshopper becomes a locust. But the concept, I think, really sticks with me as a terrifying but also cool adaptation where nature is regulating itself by creating an entity that is capable of taking away abundance so that it sets balance once again, where laying waste, raising the land also provides fertile ground for new growth, etc., but also is a terrifying reality for life, right? But if we take the concept of, okay, if we're all personally grasshoppers and then we become locusts, and then there's an environment or a status that keeps us in the locust state and we're constantly destroying everything, then one, there will be nothing left, but two, gets briefly into that cannibalizing side where I'm sure there'll be nothing for us to consume, or it'll be more advantageous for a locust to eat another locust in order to maintain one's form. And then we're wiping out everything within that concept of like this mind virus or our locust state. And I think that's why that kind of came up for me while reading this and also thinking about that article. That's why that kind of came up for me while reading this and also thinking about that article.
Yeah, there's this idea that like if the conditions are right, I mean, like it's like that like it'll catalyze a transformation that once it starts, it's really hard to reverse, and I also like that because it's something that's in nature, and I think that my thing would be like, I don't think that we can divorce this from, I don't think that we should be divorcing ourselves from nature. That includes fascism and capitalism and destruction and like our shadow. It's all part of the same thing in my mind. I mean, you can make distinctions about like natural ecology and stuff, but at this point, the distinctions start to corrode, I think, in this point in time. And I think that they're kind of artificial distinctions to begin with. the cancer cell is something that happens in nature, but it's also seen as unnatural for a lot of people, and it's caused by quote unquote unnatural processes. Similarly, the thing that we're talking about seems to be, it is like escalated by like this sort of fascistic colonialist regime, like whiteness, property, corporatization, all these different things. But it also exists, I think, outside of those as well. This is kind of like a existential thing that exists in any kind of context you would be in.
Just briefly to fact check myself. So the grasshopper locust thing is when they're in proximity towards one another and they're like overbred, so they have an abundance of like bugs, and then they decide, hey, we're going, it's like a behavioral state that they go into that is much like piranhas, I guess, in frenzy, or sharks or something.
That's interesting, an overabundance, So yeah, Zach, what else would you add to this? Like, what do we need to articulate in order to get this concept to a place where we can work with it, productively? And Carson, like, what questions do you have about this that you're like, okay, so what are we talking about? Or is it clear to you?
Yeah, I'm mulling all this over. I think what's really interesting about this concept is we're able to see the ways in which it manifests in the outside world via like all the stuff we're talking about right now. And I think it is even more interesting to see like to think about how it manifests within us, and like to realize that the only thing that we can actually control, if there is some spiritual battle between good and evil going on in the outside world, and it's like really going on and we're like realizing that, the only thing that we can actually control is like the battle within ourselves, which sounds cheesy, but it's like we all are infected. And I think some of the ways that I see this concept manifesting in myself, like I mentioned before, like addiction. Like I'm not like, I think many of us are our age and like backgrounds, like don't I've never had like a addiction so intense that I couldn't live my life. And I think sometimes I'm almost like maybe I don't have addictions, but there are definitely things. Drinking, nicotine has been off and on for so many years, and I think it's off now, but like all these things that society feeds to us um are also manifestations of the parasite. And the only thing that we can do to help win this battle is to like overcome that within ourselves or something. Like it gives me like a motivation, like seeing that how the inside of myself is connected to the outside.
Yeah.
But there are also like another thing I was thinking about a lot is it also manifests itself in like apathy, like and self-doubt, and like there's been so many times the last 7 or 8 months with all the Gaza stuff, and like periods of very intense involvement and then pretty heavy burnout and self-doubt of like, oh, actually I don't know if I have a role to play in this or if I can even do anything, what's the point. And I think those thoughts in themselves are like parasitic thoughts, like there's something that wants to prevent me from doing good is a way to think about it. And thinking about it that way at least allows me to flip my brain a little and be like, okay, but there's also the part of me that does want to do good, and I believe that part could be stronger. It feels a little unrelated maybe to this question of archetypes, but I think just like, yeah, thinking about, I'd be curious what y'all think too. Where does this manifest within you?
Yeah, that was definitely something I wanted to spend a lot of time in, seeing like, yeah. But yeah, the shadow would be a good like unifying term for that. Just like but something I wanted to add to that is that like on last episode I kind of had like I like was super emotional. I've had a couple of like times throughout my life where I think all of you have seen me kind of like break down a little bit, just because I feel really overwhelmed by like the world that we live in, and it's like I will say like we're addicted not only to like things that society sees as bad, but also there's things that I see as bad that society, quote unquote, doesn't necessarily see as bad, that I'm also addicted to kind of by necessity. Like I can't really exist socially if I'm not doing those things. So it's the self and it's other. It's like, but like they're intimately linked. And I will say that like I want to talk about the process of I want us to talk about the alchemical process and like the Western esoteric tradition a little bit as we go on, in the way that they link the inner and external worlds. Some things I wanted to cite, bookmark a little bit. Yeah. But the self, like orienting it within yourself and finding how. I guess I have an anecdote about this. I wanted to check in with Carson really quickly first, though. Like, where are you at right now? Because, like, again, being kind of like plunged into this episode as kind of our guinea pig, like trying out these thoughts on you. Do you feel like you have a grasp of what we're talking about right now? Do you have anything to add to like what you maybe want to extend this topic to?
Yeah, I could stir the pot a little. I'm following. I'm definitely following. I think it's like I guess maybe I have a bit of a hard time of like this like trans historical like equating like one I don't know like equating what feel like pretty different things to like the same root or something, and maybe like I was thinking about Josh, because or maybe Josh, you don't want to answer this, but like what like how is this much different from like sin? And like I like that we're getting into like this like in what context does this feel good, and like to what ends like does that serve, and sort of like being in like this feedback loop of like, if we want to call it like this Wetiko, like because something we've been talking a lot about is like we are participating in things that we don't want to be participating in, but then you are rewarded for participating in them, so that reward does feel good. So it's like how do I not actually like how do you like unplug and live more selflessly, or is that always like in what instances is living like selfishly good, or like healthy, or feel good, or necessary, and I don't know, like when it's at the expense where and I'm also sorry, I'm just throwing everything out there that I was thinking of when I'm also thinking about like this, yeah, like when the grasshopper becomes a locust, like it's a swarm, it's like all consuming, it's too much, like when does cancer become like malignant? When it's like too much, when it's actually harming the body, it's no longer benign. Like it's this like at what point does like a selfishness or become too much, where it becomes like asocial or antisocial, like and yeah, I mean I think this has a lot. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Was that directed like specifically to me because I think there were like several things that both
Yeah,
Zach and
the first part.
Jackie, like the sin stuff.
I guess just to like respond in meta, and then maybe we can focus on sin. But like to respond in meta to your like what you were saying, I feel like what you're listing is like all these different ways where it's like, when does something good become bad and something bad become good? Like that's kind of the existential question that we arrived to with this. Beyond the historicity of it and like the specific historic positioning of it, but I think that we can agree that like at this point, even when you look at no matter how you look at it, and this is something that Paul Levy talks about, but the thing you can deconstruct whatever your tool you're looking at to look at it with. Like these things are so hard to pin down that you need to contain it in order to discuss it. But even by containing it, you are doing a disservice to this quest to like figure this thing out because then you're not talking about the other parts of it. So it's kind of a conundrum that exists.
Maybe what I'm
in the
trying to
limited
get at.
linguistic lexicon that we have, and yeah.
Maybe what I'm trying to get at is like I like this, like instead of focusing maybe on the container, that it's like how does the context in which something is used like become like its opposite of like violence, like how does because we could talk about like violence is bad, like I'm a pacifist, I don't believe in violence, in the same way of like, sorry, these are just the things I'm thinking of like at what point is violence necessary even though you don't want to be violent, like you it like goes against the core of like who, I don't know how you feel, and like yeah.
Carson, can I ask you a quick question on the violence piece? Like, because
Yeah,
I
what?
think this might be helpful. Have you ever physically fought with your brothers?
Yeah, like not punching in the face.
Right, but like I think that's like a
What?
great way of like looking at it. Like I feel like you may not have like decided I'm gonna break every tooth in your mouth like to fight your brothers, but when you're fighting them, you're expressing anger or frustration with them and communicating it non-verbally. But at the end of the day, like after that moment of fighting and beyond that, you're a little bit closer because then you understand them a bit better. And it's not necessarily that you were out to kill them, but you're out to communicate in a way. Like I was even thinking about like the way that dogs form packs with each other, and I know they dispelled the sort of like alpha like dog whatever, but there's certain types of like dog play that looks like violence, but there's like a language being communicated there of like, power dynamics that we're all existing in, but by sort of expressing them and playing them out and making almost like a theater of them, we're able to not only understand the concept of power more, but we're able to understand the like person or other dog that we're in combat with more as well. In the same way that like in martial arts you have a sparring partner and you learn about the way people move, and so it's like violence is another type of language, I think. And again, violence in excess, like when it has this sort of virus manifestation, or the virus maybe pushes one to use the language a bit in its extreme for the sake of something that may be selfish, that may be a good way of understanding how the mind virus works, in the sense that it like injects a third party into a maybe more balanced form of communication. But that's just like me going off of like languages as a route to try to contain the virus.
Well, to me, also going along with the theme of like the invisible stuff parts, the parts that are imperceptible to us, are the parts that are the worst. And violence, right? I think there's plenty of examples for us as Americans because, like, that go also to things that we've talked about in this podcast and themes that I think deserve to be unpacked more. But one of the themes that we could, and the concepts we could pick back up here, is the idea of slow violence, which is an idea of the violence that takes place on timescales that are so outside of the scope of a Homo sapiens lifespan that we can't perceive them in our lifetimes. And our everyday lives contribute to that slow violence because of ecological factors. And that's something that's imperceptible to us unless it is. And it also kind of goes to this question of like scale, like at what point is it too much? Well, there will never be a too much. Like, I think that's another conundrum there. And then on a grander scale though, and like, it's hard to get footing here, but like on a grander scale, the question really becomes, the proposition that's put forth by Paul Levy is that by doing inner work of like identifying somewhere in me, there is a desire to see the world truly apocalyptically change. What is that about? Like, how do I sit with that? How do I incorporate that? How do I figure out where that comes from? And like, by doing that work, it's reflected in the outer worlds. And it's like, you guys are everyone listening has somewhere in them that desire for radical change, which is like a fiery, or not, like it's apocalyptic change. It's somewhere in us, is the proposition that Paul Levy would put forth. And only by going within can we actually shift the way that things manifest outside of us. But he also says that like we need to do political action, and these things are systemically created, and there's like systems outside of our control that are operating as well. But maybe those systems that automate things for us are part of a desire that we have for automation and ease. And maybe maybe you can find it. Maybe you can find it all within yourself. I think that's another really interesting topic. And like additional complexity here, I wanted to bring up this theme of like, can you shape things truly by looking within yourself? I wanted to share an anecdote about reading this book. I was reading this thing about the shadow projection, this idea that like, I think that you are lazy because I'm lazy, And then whenever I call you lazy, that's because I'm lazy and I feel insecure about it, so I have to project it out into an external body so that my ego can protect me. So I was reading this part, and there's also this idea that everyone has different hooks that attract projections in certain ways. And I was thinking about this relationship I had with my coworker, where, not a romantic one, but like recently, where they were like blaming me for something that like I didn't do. And I was like, motherfucker. And I also heard someone say, like, call me a retard under her breath. Like when we were like washing dishes, and I was like, you don't have to do it that way. And she was like, fucking retard. And I was like, and then I was like, you're so fucking stupid, you motherfucker. You know what I mean? But like people, and so like Levy proposes that there are hooks somewhere in me. There is actually insecurity about neurotypicality, right? So like, I was dreaming her up like in a nightmare, where you have a nemesis in a nightmare. I was dreaming her up to say that to me, so that I could be like, I'm actually superior to you. I'm actually, you're fucking stupid. So that I could then recognize this insecurity I have about this and like work on it somehow. I was reading this passage and I was like, I kept being like, okay, but how does that relate to fucking Palestine? Like, how does that relate to all these fucking crazy things that are happening that I clearly don't want to be happening? Like, those are bad things that bad people are doing. And then I was reading this, and then I got called off of work. The boss was like, oh, we probably don't need you. It's like super slow today. It's like, fuck you. But then I was also like, oh, good. Because I was like, I'm done with this place anyway. I'm like so done with this place. I'm going to start doing something else instead. I'm like so over this. Anyway, so all these things were happening synchronously. And I was like reading at this cafe, like really trying to feel like, okay, what if I take this seriously and What do I want to see change in the world? What are some bad people? What are some bad things that I would like? How can I try to change something? And then I come home and I see Hasanabi has like 120,000 viewers. I'm like, oh shit, what happened? And it's like Trump's assassination attempt was what happened. What happened then? A guy goes and tries to kill Trump, and he dies. We don't know what his motives were, and that's actually kind of interesting in this topic. But like, he tries to shoot, and then gets killed. Was it a conspiracy? Whatever. I don't fucking know. That's a whole different topic. But the idea that like I would maybe be like, okay, who's someone that if I could change anything in the world, what if I just killed the Trump in me, right? The thing is, it backfired politically. Now it's like more likely than ever that he's gonna be fucking president again. Like, so it's like the opposite of what you're trying to. It's sort of that back and forth of like, did I not go fully enough into my own shadow to have that change happen? Is it completely schizo to think that I had anything to do with that? Or is it just, the synchronicity there I think was really interesting. And also the way that there's a monkey's paw there. I feel like if you don't go deep enough, that always emerges. It happens, but the effects are converse to what you expected them to be. Or it happens, but in a way that you would never have expected it to. I was wondering if you guys have any experiences with this sort of synchronicity that happens when you try to do that inner work. If you've ever seen inner represented in the outer in ways like that.
Yo, the FBI. I was saying, the FBI is listening, so I can't speak like too plainly. But I think that, of course, like 100%. Do you ever have those moments where you feel like you've locked something down, everything is super, super protected, and you're kind of like, the idea of a lock is not because you are always under attack and people are always trying to rob you, but to prevent the off chance that like someone's trying to rob you. And there was a moment, like specifically with my bike, I'm like, you know what? Like, I'm locking it up. I'm very, very diligent about making sure the front tire is locked to the frame of the bike, et cetera, et cetera. But there was a moment where, and this is very innocuous and stupid, but there was a moment where I had done all of these things, and I have that like weird sinking feeling that that like I wasn't locked enough or whatever, but I always like lock my car 4 times and like make sure I pull on the lock to make sure it's locked, etc. And then the next morning someone stole my bike helmet. And then after that, like I came back to that place the next day, and then the like NATO summit thing is not next day, but like a few weeks later or whatever, NATO summit thing is, it was a month later, but it's the same area and the NATO summit fences are raising. So it's like, oh, like this is like a cascading like series of people defending property and life or whatever. And I think that's kind of what you're feeling like. It's like every time I go into that area, it's like a sense of danger, one, for police activity, but also in the name of security. And it's this cycle of perception of the bandit, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, what if it's on such a scale like that? I mean, if we take the alchemy proposition as above, so below, if we take it fully seriously, that has a lot of implications for things we do in our daily lives that we don't think of as bad. But, are we standing on business about this thing that wealth should be distributed equally? Are we standing on these things? But then it's like you immediately come into contact with this thing where, these structures. The structures are what makes that happen. Like the society we live in funnels wealth to the, it's not my fault. So, but I don't know. That's kind of a part that I actually am genuinely a little bit confused about. But I think maybe those structures are part of things that we can think with. That's kind of the cyborg aspect of this. Maybe that's coextensive with us to some extent that we don't want to believe it is. The structures that do things automatically that we want to disavow Like, that's bad. That shouldn't be happening. What if there is a way that we can actually inhabit those things? Or that we do inhabit those things?
I was just gonna ask a related question of Carson and Zach, and like maybe, and feel free to like push it aside. But what does like fighting with your shadow look like? Similar to what Jackie's saying, like, you know what I mean? Like, I think that's where you're going, right? Like fighting with this inner demon, and maybe that demon is gaining power from structures, right? And then becomes a logic system, if I heard you correctly. That oversimplification, of course, but like trying to follow that thread in like a maybe a Spark Notes version.
Yeah, it's like, how do you grapple with these global issues within yourself? Do you see them connected? And if so, how?
The one example I'm thinking about is so at the time when I went in to do the psychedelic sound bath thing that I was talking about at the beginning, where I was thinking about the parasite the whole time. The one like issue that was like really on my mind was we were the band I play in, we were set to play at South by Southwest. And I don't know if you guys saw, like, I mean, South by Southwest has been shitty for years and years and years, but this year it was especially shitty because their like super sponsor was the literal US Army. And this was like the weekend before I was supposed to go, and I was really you know, there were conversations about pulling out. I was like wondering if I should just not go at all, because it felt like an impossible situation where even if you pulled out of the official showcases or whatever, you're still there in Austin playing shows that are thriving off of the ecosystem of South by Southwest in any case. And my realization when I was lying there was like, of course I'm so confused, and I personally don't know what the hell to do, because this parasite thing has got music. Like, it got music. Like, the music industry itself, any sort of festival where people are making money, like any just the idea that you can do music as a job, and not for any sort of like communal reason or like spiritual reason or whatever, um you know, music has like lost its power, and I'm really confused, not knowing what to do. And like, then I struggle with that in myself, obviously, because I want to, make a living. It'd be cool to do it doing something I love, but um I definitely have parts of myself that are attracted to like the feeling of being on stage in front of a lot of people and fame or whatever, as we all are. And then I would like to tell myself that I don't want that at all. Um, but I think like through like grappling with that question, we did end up going to South by Southwest. We ended up not playing any official showcases. And then like it didn't even really matter that we pulled out. I mean, it did matter, but like also like when the week was over, there was a thing in Rolling Stone of like top artists at South by, and there was like a picture of us and like a little blurb about us. So it was like they didn't. I just felt like we had been played or something. So it was like we did go, we did pull out, and then like in the reporting on it, it's as if we didn't pull out anyways. But they did. Next year, the U.S. Army is not a sponsor of South by, so I guess enough artists pulled out to at least send a message to South by. But they'll probably just find something else awful to replace it. And ultimately, I do believe that like music as a whole is like kind of been it's rotted in some ways, especially like that part of I'd be curious to hear, to connect it to the book, of like what was brought up in the book as ways of dispelling, ways of cleansing, or ways of scrubbing this out, you know? Like, because if even, I feel like this is the, like Zach, it's like the idea of like capture that, like, and you know, even the antidote, even something like music, even some like even the cleansing, if you can call it that, the exorcism can be infected itself. Like, and what do you do when that is like the case? Yeah, and that's an interesting, like, I know some other people that ended up going South by Southwest and playing like in like gas stations that they weren't like official festival sites or whatever. But it's like, I see what you mean. Like the ecosystem, like it's still feeding on like, I don't know, some like rotten bits. But we gotta also, you know, we gotta take what we, you know, like take do and take what we can, like because yeah, like we gotta survive. And but I am curious, maybe to put it out there, maybe to shift towards like this, like what solutions were historically like used or proposed for like Wetiko, or like what does a society, a group, because like we focused a lot on like this inward thing, but to bring it back maybe to last episode about like exile and like dropping out, and like this outside of like a social normalcy, like what was done, like what was practiced. Yeah, if there was anything in the book that was talked about.
Well, it's interesting, like, he, maybe in line with what we're saying about, like, what was, like, doesn't really talk about what was done in different contexts, like pre-colonial contexts. But he does see, he does have a couple solutions for this, a couple diagnostics, that are correspond to his allegiance to this Western occultist lineage called alchemy, and he also cites like Gnosticism in this as well, Hermeticism, which I respect, because Western occultism is like an attempt to like create some kind of like spirited existence from like out of the shell, out of the like living corpse that is like white culture, like cut off from a sense of origin, and perhaps cut off from origin to begin with. I'm bringing in like Haraway here too. His diagnosis is that creativity is what makes us human. Creativity, like true creativity. Not creativity to get into Rolling Stone, but creativity to inspire your bandmates. Um, and then also like dreaming up each other. I dreamt up my coworker to tell me that I'm an R word. Because but there's other ways to dream up people. I dreamed up you guys so that I could like I could try to figure out like the position that we're in and try to meditate on like change and why I long for it and what kinds of change I want and what kinds of stability I want. Dreaming each other creatively in that genuine sense is his diagnosis. That's what's going to return us to like a state of humanity. My thing is that I think that the solution is to accept that we are not good. I do still believe in creativity and dreaming each other and collaboration and also the inner work of like finding what you really want. But I don't think that there's something to return to. I think that people have always been this way and all of existence is always this way. And this actually corresponds to alchemy, because alchemy has this idea that you go into the darkest shit in order to nourish the most beautiful flower. And the flower, the ultimate flower, the sun of it all, is like the pure gold of it all. You're never actually really going to arrive to. But you're still constantly transmuting whatever you find to try to find out how you can find this center, but will never find it. So my thing would be that like, and there's also all these different traditions that talk about, enlightened people come back to different fallen worlds. So if that's the case, if you're just going to come back, then you have to really sit with the fallenness too, So like my thing is always that like, that's where I find that is exactly what I'm trying to figure out with y'all, with this project. How, if we're going to accept that we are fallen to some extent, and that it's impossible to get to not fallen, then what can we search for? Like, what can we creatively seek in this world? So I think that for me, like, the diagnosis is, like, personally, the diagnosis is, like, look inwardly, but, like, and, like, really try to be realistic about what you desire and keep unpacking that. Keep looking for what you really desire. Continuing to, including the bad stuff. And then just be expressive and creative about that. Try to transmute it productively with other people. But, like, honestly, this project is exactly me trying to figure out, like, what to do with that. But, yeah, I'm definitely interested in sin in this context still. But also, yeah, what do you guys think?
That is reminding me actually about a very important thing about South by that I think was in some ways an antidote. And first of all, like, I think myself being in turmoil about whether I should go or not, and like that, again, like taking away energy, mental energy, and like preventing me from living my life on those days here and now, like, was something that did not work in removing this virus. But one thing that was really cool actually was out in Austin. There was an alternative festival called Smash by Smash West, I think, or maybe Smash by Southwest. No, Smash by Smash West, and it was like this very decentralized. People could kind of submit their own DIY shows that were happening that week, or like actions that were happening, and I think that ultimately also played a really big role in like South by dropping the US Army sponsorship for next year. And I think it's like such a good example of dreaming up, what you want And I think like, yeah, it's very hard to think creatively in that way, but that is so much more effective than just like thinking like, should I or shouldn't I do this in an option that's laid in front of me. Um,
I think one thing that I'm hearing you both say is that internal work isn't enough. You have to do internal work with a community of people who are also doing similar work. And not to get to the woo woo lefty, like, oh, community is the answer to everything, because I don't think that's necessarily true. But when I heard you both speak, I also thought about that fear of being the one that throws the first brick. But it kind of, when you confront, as you say, like, look at your desires, look at what you want, and actively strive to create the sort of positive version of that, and you're honest with yourself about all of these things, and you find, I mean, I'm also kind of pulling from that like related article, right, where it's kind of pull from all of these disciplines that are grounded in sort of life bringing concepts and traditions and ways of being, in order to actualize the future that you want to see. I think that I don't know. I think that's part of it, right? Like, the idea that this is a mind virus also like touches on the fact that you can't cure it with like a single potion. You don't just drink a potion and like suddenly the virus is gone. It's a slow process of you developing antibodies that combat this virus, and soon, like, if the virus is global, but if you start the process of creating those antibodies and like learn from other quote unquote cells that are creating these antibodies, it will spread to an immunity to the virus. Hopefully, that's the idea.
Yes. I also wanted to say that, I wanted to thank you for saying that, because I think that virality isn't just negative or positive. Like, virality is a condition of existence, you know? And so, like, just as much as there could be bad versions of all these things, there's also good ones. And we've already basically seen that good and bad are very, like, they don't really work in this context. Which is why, like, spirits, demons and spirits, angels, they all have a whole range of ways that they relate to our understanding of good and bad. So, same with these sort of viral entities and parasites or symbionts. They can be multivalent and have different functions, I think. Also, the essay is now found on filmsforaction.org, Seeing Wetiko on Capitalism, Mind Viruses, and Antidotes for World in Transition. Here, I'll just read that last quote just so that we can highlight the part that Josh was bringing up there. Let us dance with thought forms through a deeper understanding of ethics, knowing, and being, and the intimate awareness that our individual minds and bodies are a part of the collective battleground for the soul of humanity, and indeed, life on this planet. And let us re-embrace the ancient futures of our indigenous ancestors that represent the only continuous line of living in symbiosis with Mother Nature. The dissolution of Wetiko will be as much about the remembering as it will be about creation. So obviously I am a little bit anti-return, but also, I'm anti this idea of a stable self, stable community, stable nature that they are referencing, Mother Nature being something that we are out of sync with. But at the same time, I also think that there's a sort of like beautiful vampire being a sort of a really a dead form of necromancy. I think there's also a really beautiful form of necromancy that is returning and is digging things up from the depths, but in a way that actually invites life, which to me means change and flourishing in new ways, creatively. So I think that going back to things is beautiful and should happen and always does happen. All that comes before us. You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? I don't think so. But like, it is true, like we are a product of all that's around us and all that came before. But like we can use that creatively to like make, and we have to. We can't go back to that. That's not, but like we can bring that energy to bear in novel ways and try to access a collective world, and a better world is possible. Like, yeah.
Yeah, to continue on this like hopeful, I'm liking thinking about dreaming and like dreaming up, and because like yeah, I think it's supposed to be that like dreams are when the subconscious like sorts some things out, when it like figures some shit out for you, and it's kind of beautiful that you don't have to actually do all that much. Like you're actually literally doing nothing. Like it's nice that maybe I don't know, like if we're talking about like dropping out, checking out, like that. But sure, like you do nothing, you sleep, you rest, which is recharging. But also like you're doing some work at the same time, like maybe a little passively. But it is interesting to think about like the strain, and like that a dream can be a nightmare, and that you can really go through some shit. Like, but that it is about learning, I guess. That it's like, how can we look at all of these things? How can we look at Wetiko? How can we look at addiction? How can we look at like the the violence machine that we take part in, and how can we like learn? And I think this goes back to what Zach was saying too about like this awareness of like, and I guess is like this is pretty in line with like a lot of spiritual traditions of like an enlightenment and a salvation of I will take on the suffering and pain, and I will die for your sins. Like I like I think there's some interesting things about like asceticism. Why do I say that word wrong? Asceticism, and in relation to this conversation of like, I don't know, like it's both beautiful that healing and figuring things out can be like it's already happening. Like the change is already happening. Like even when you sleep or something. But also like this active giving up of like things we know are rotten, things that have become rotten. But if everything's become rotten and giving everything up, then I don't know. But maybe it's more just like what's the desire there? Like the desire is, I think what Jackie's saying, it's desire for something different, something new, and that's always nice to like keep in mind.
Yeah, like, well, Zach was saying that, like, building some buildings, like having an alternative that was generated through collectivity was like key in that instance. But there's a relationship between maybe like the letting go and the generation, like, yeah, it's I think in our four diagnoses, we've all had kind of slightly different stances on like, are we giving stuff up or are we doing stuff, differently? But I think they probably go hand in hand there, and just like, yeah, like, are we bringing awareness to the dream, or are we surrendering it to it more? I kind of feel like both would lead to interesting things, but I think that I don't know. What do we think about that? I mean, I think that is the kind of last kind of dividing thing that we have here, which I'm ambivalent about actually, but it's like, this is the question that I have a little bit. It's like, are we supposed to be surrendering to this thing, or are we supposed to be, I mean, it's a combination though. That's what meditation is, because as soon as you have it, as soon as you're like, okay, I feel this way, it transforms. And that's what's so crazy about alchemy. Another thing about alchemy I wanted to bring in is that it's about paying attention to the materials and really giving them your attention. Like, you're being there with the materials, like whatever's in your laboratory, the laboratory being like the material circumstances you're in, and also including like all the subconscious stuff. Just by knowing what you have and looking around, poking around, it will, and like applying creative attention. You're not saying I want to make a bear. You're saying like, what do I have here? What happens if I do this and this? Like, there's a spirit of creativity that comes over you when you're paying attention to your materials. Beautiful things emerge that you wouldn't have expected to have emerged. So there's like kind of this, you're both doing things and also not completely certain about what's going to happen, but you have also a spirit of like a creative spirit, you know? Now, you know, perhaps there's a different approach where we're all saying like, we need to find something to focus on together, you know? And if we focus on something, then maybe we can bring it to be.
I have a nice quote that I just thought of. I'm forgetting her name. There's a poet that I think her name was Anne Bishop.
Elizabeth Bishop?
Elizabeth Bishop. Yeah. That she was saying that like what is required for making art is like a self-forgetful, perfectly useless concentration. And like yeah, like just thinking about alchemy and thinking about maybe like this focus and concentration on form. Maybe Zach, you could speak to this about like, I don't know, like this ability to like bend and create, like once you really have like concentrated on like a form. And I don't know if this is really making sense, but like it's like, yeah, thinking about not making music for whatever else, but it's like pure form and uselessness, and like that you don't know what's going to happen from that.
Actually, that does tie into, I mean, like, we're maybe wrapping up here, and I want to maybe read this manifesto so we can think of ways to mutate it, but this ties into questions I actually had about Zach's art practice, actually. His, like, solo violin work. So we're going to put him on the limelight here in a second, but I just wanted to, like, bring this in just so that we're thinking about it as we approach close here sometime. So again, currently what we have is no one, not two. Try to love through. Shape change in the nether-pool and drown with friends to arise anew again and again. So, Zach's live performances, I mean, in high school, he was like a genius. He was already like savant violinist in my eyes. And he like learned like the traditional like Western, you know, scale to a T, you know, and was like able to do all these different instruments and everything, and performed kind of perfectly, quote unquote, within that system. But then like fast forward to today, like the live sets that I've seen and his music in general is like it takes sort of like motifs and loops of like a violin and then like warps it slowly into these grand arrangements. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about like your methodology with live performance in tandem with Carson's question about how this approach happened with the South by thing, and more so like what is the relationship between intention and improvisation, I suppose, in your like solo live performances.
I feel like I've gotten to a point now in the last few years where like when I play live, I have like a process with my pedals and my loop pedals and the order in which I do things, but the actual notes themselves are uh always different. And like I don't know, it's cool because I think well I've actually recently, especially like the last year or two, I've been starting to get kind of down on like what I do live because I'm just like I've been doing this for I don't know, since like 2017 now, like 7 years. Um, but then I realized that like actually the notes themselves are different, and like there's just a lot of people that haven't heard me do that thing, and it's still just like for some reason what I feel called to do when I'm playing live. Um, I used to do like in the LA times, I would kind of like alternate between doing like a sort of chill ambient, very tonal soothing thing and like doing more of like a noise set or something. And since the pandemic, I've pretty much only done like chill. I mean, I don't even know if chill is the right word, but like yeah, more soothing, I guess, like drone based tonal stuff. Um But I actually think, well, I had a show last weekend. It went really good. I have another show next weekend, and I'm really itching to do a freaking noise set. So I think I'm gonna do it. And I think that's like there is like that like kind of interesting in this context too of like this balance between the good and the evil or the whatever and like trying to like um find that balance. But yeah, as far as like actual music making goes, like I think the past few months, the past year or so, I've really been experimenting with just trying to get myself more in a position of just like making music for its own sake. And that actually requires um not thinking about playing shows or something, which is hard because that's like I'm definitely addicted to playing shows. I love playing shows. It's like when I feel the most myself and like happy to be alive and stuff. Um, but I've like I don't know, I've started taking violin lessons in a different style and like Indian classical music for the last like 3 or 4 months, which has been so cool and like just getting myself in the routine of practicing again and like trying to learn this new technique and being like I'm not going to be performing in this way, I don't think ever. Or if I did, it would take like 15 or 20 years. Um, it just like forces me to just enjoy like the making of the sound. Um, and also just like participating in like, um, we were just today at this thing called Sacred Harp. Do y'all know about this? It's like a singing tradition. Um, in it's like this group singing thing you do in a church often, and it's kind of these like old hymns um, that are written out with these shapes so you can sort of like sight sing it theoretically. But it's just so like you just go and you sit there for 2 hours and you just like sing these prayers with 15, 20 people, and it's like I feel so good when I come out of that. So it's like yeah, trying to I think the key to a lot of this stuff is just like always pushing yourself to try something new. And like even if you feel like you've got something down to uh get out of the comfort zone and just like even the world of music itself is just so expansive. There's like so much that one person could never know or understand at all. Um Now how this ties someone else might have to do the work of tying this to our topic.
Well, I thought I wanted to highlight this interesting thing as well, not only between like harmony and dissonance, and like soothing and upsetting, but also this really interesting thing that like you gotta try something new, but sometimes that means building a process that you do for 17 years. Um, because like within the repetition of building those forms, building those circuits, that part becomes automatic, and then like the experimentation and the intuition like arrives in a different place because the intention and the attention that you bring to it kind of rises beyond the routine of like, okay, now I do this pedal, now I do this pedal, now I do this pedal. So there's always like a new horizon despite the fact that you're repeating something, which I think relates to our again and again thing, and this idea that we're building a structure but also innovating off of it repeatedly. And like, yeah, and collectively. I was also wondering if you have, like, do you think that, yeah, I mean, there's a whole nother, I don't think that we have time to get into this thing about the performer and the audience being sort of like potentially kind of like intersubjective at times when you get into these trance-like states. But that's a whole, I don't think we really have time for that, but I think that's connected here, this dreaming,
I could say one thing maybe really briefly, just that like I think I'm learning recently that it really, if you want to like get out of the like performer audience like hierarchy or whatever, it does really take this like intention from everyone. Like there has to be, like I've started to try to just like talk before I do my solo sets a little bit, just to be like, don't, like, you don't have to look at me. Like you could also just close your eyes and focus on your breathing or something, or focus on whatever you want to focus on, but it doesn't have to be like this it doesn't have to be on me. And even though I'm providing the sound, and I think like um there's a lot of ways to create those different environments or different intentions that don't include talking. It could just be different spatial arrangements, um signs on the wall. I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, I think words are really important. Like to return to what I started with, and this Paul Levy talks about this a lot, but intentions matter a lot, and there's got to be some way to solidify them. Be an architect of intention, so that you like build something that then allows you to generate organically. But that's what we're doing here with this dang manifesto. Do you guys want to spend any more time on anything else as we like focus here on like what we want to change about this manifesto? Is there anything else you want to explore before we kind of bring this to a close?
Could you do like a breakdown? It could be brief, but of like what was added to the manifesto since 3B, I guess. Or even if you remember.
What do we have in 3? I mean, I so like for the listening audience on our TikTok and Instagram, we actually have the entire evolution fitted to little scenes that I've been kind of like making a little bit. It's been a fun little way to add a sort of visual aspect to this. But okay, 3 was, I think, okay, so now we added again and again at 3B, I believe. So drown with friends again and again. And that was kind of like Josh cited Dark Souls with that and like Souls-like games, but this idea that repetition is like essential. Like we need to keep coming together again and again to build a muscle. Basically, the muscle then allows something to change in a more sinuous way. In a more agentive way, I suppose. No one, not two. That's from a Cyborg Manifesto. It's a quote from Donna Haraway's The Cyborg Manifesto. It's this subjectivity that is not located just in the self, but it's also, I don't have two people. I don't have two people. So, like, it's somewhere
like
between...
an anti-binary. Like, there is no
Yes.
origin, but also the answer isn't a binary.
Which is another hermetic principle.
don't
This
know.
idea that there's, like, a binary, and then there's something, a secret third thing. To use the mimetic version of it. But truly, it's not, I'm not just me, but I'm also not two people. I'm not someone else. So, like, what is that dynamic between the ineffable and the local, I suppose? And then the last thing we added and then we did Chud, which was the nether. Instead of doing mutagenic pool,
Nether,
we
yeah.
decided to go, like, nether, which means, I think, this downward direction of it. This, I think, is like truly grounding and then like beyond grounding, This idea of like, we've already kind of did that with drowning, but I think, I don't know, Josh, the nether, he actually referenced Minecraft for that, which I really like that we're bringing video game mythology into this because it's like, it is a telling part of our collective unconscious right now, I think, but the nether being kind of like an underworld that you emerge from, I suppose. That you go down to seek things in, and then like the Orpheus of it all. You're seeing what's down there, and you're trying to be with that a little bit, even if you are gonna at some point come back out of it.
I feel like this ties to what you were just saying too about this like this, well, and also this episode of like this archaeology of yourself and this architecture of like a digging and a building, like you go under, see what's going on, you learn from it, and we build.
Yeah, I mean, and then we added love to the last one. Try to love through because of the fact that like when someone's exiled, like love being an ambivalent thing that's difficult to do. But trying to love through the permutations that you go through and that other people go through, So, but I think building might be something here. If we're talking about structure, and we've talked about nether stuff, what does it mean to build architecturally? Not necessarily upwards, but I don't think that we want to be building upwards, but maybe it's. But we've talked about nether, so maybe what is another thing for what is like a
This is the rhizome kind of, right? The not arboreal, not up, not the tree, but the rhizome, the network. I don't know.
like extend your roots.
Like what is a potent thing that has come out of? I don't know. Like what is a potent thing through this book, Zach? Through your experience, like in the sound bath.
I do like the dreaming up phrase that we've talking about a lot, and also just like thinking about the idea that we're always dreaming up, whether we realize it or not, and so the key is to dream up intentionally.
Mm. Mm. Maybe that's the shaping. Maybe that's the shaping of the change. Maybe that's the change.
Was Carson, Josh, are there any things you two want to plug at the end of here?
I mean, always the news cycle. I always do something revolving around that. But Biden got COVID, so let that be known. Keep your eyes out. The RNC is happening now, so I just like really struggle through those like viral thinkings. Maybe even notice the virus in the memes that you digest, and that's it.
Word. Zach, anything you would like to plug?
I don't know. I have a solo album coming out.
Yeah, we've been honestly. Zach's music has been interspersed throughout the episodes before this, so you've heard tastes of it already. But I recommend listening to Zachary Paul. Summons is one of my favorite albums of his that's on Spotify. Beautiful work. If you have the chance to see him live, do that as well. I'll also plug, I guess, Chanel Beads for you. Again, shouts out.
Shouts out. But yeah, be nice. Be nice to each other. Drink a lot of water. It's really hot outside. And don't let the virus get in the way of a healthy body and a good attitude.
Yeah. Thank you all very much for being here. I really appreciate it. Zach, I really appreciate you coming on. Everyone, I really, appreciate you also being here. The love, the intention, the play, the exploration. We've got an Instagram, a TikTok, and a YouTube. If you want to listen to this on YouTube, rate us 5 stars on the Spotify app, please, and follow us.
No one, not two, dream up shadows to love through, shape change in the nether-pool, and drown with friends to arise anew again and again.